Hello, Year 7s, and welcome back in today's science lesson. In today's science lesson, we're going to be learning about how to work scientifically, and in particular, know what the scientific method is and understand the process of it. So, these are our learning outcomes for today. I would like you to pause the video, read the learning outcomes, and then press play when you're ready to continue. So, the big question in today's lesson, and hopefully we can answer it by the end of the lesson, is how do most scientists work? So, in your science class, you may have conducted many experiments, many investigations, and seen your teacher demonstrate to you all these experiments and investigations. Well, it's true for that in the real world as well. Scientists all over the world are conducting experiments and investigations every day. And we need to know how they do this. It's a very important process in science, and we're going to go through that in today's lesson. So, the scientific method. Now, some of you may be aware of this, as you may have learned this in Key Stage 2. But if you haven't, don't worry, I'm going to go through it with you. So, with the scientific method, it usually starts off with an observation. We observe and look at something that we don't particularly understand. Then we formulate a question based on that observation. So we've seen something that we don't understand, but we want to know how it works or why it works that way. And we ask that question. And once you have a question, you then formulate a hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis is a possible explanation to that question that was asked. We'll talk more about hypothesis a bit later on. Now, it doesn't show here, but with the hypothesis, you also will make a prediction. And that prediction is a suggestion of what you think is going to happen. And this can be tested. So once you have formulated your hypothesis and prediction, then you can start to conduct your experiments. And once you have conducted the experiment, then you can draw conclusions based on the results of that experiment. And this continues on with other scientists that will continue on testing the hypothesis. They will be testing your hypothesis. So other scientists are going to get involved and test that hypothesis to see if they get the same evidence as well. And the more evidence that supports the hypothesis, it becomes an accepted theory, a scientific theory. So that's how scientific theories come to be. So let's look at this example. You can see there's two pictures here. The first picture is of a pond, and the second picture is of the ocean. So it's at the coast of the ocean. And this is during the winter time. And you notice that the pond freezes at a higher temperature than the ocean. So the pond freezes at, let's say, 0 degrees Celsius. So that's when it starts to freeze. You can see the ice forming here. However, with the ocean, it's also 0 degrees Celsius here, but it hasn't frozen yet. And you wonder why that is the case. How come that is happening? So the question that you might come up with is, why does the pond water tend to freeze at higher temperatures than the ocean does? So that is your question. So through your observation, you then ask this question, and then we formulate a hypothesis as a possible explanation from what is being observed. So the hypothesis for this particular observation is the presence of salt affects the freezing point of water. Now, this is a good hypothesis because it's something that we can test. First of all, it's something that we can observe and test. So observe plus test. We know that pond water is usually a fresh water source, so there's no salt in pond water, and we know that the ocean has salt in it, has salt water. So that's the observation, and it's also testable. We can test this. An example of a bad hypothesis would be something like this. Fairy magic makes water freeze faster. So now pause the video, think why this is a bad hypothesis, and then press play once you have something in mind. So the reason why this is a bad hypothesis is simply because we cannot observe this and we cannot test this. We cannot observe fairy magic because this is something that we cannot see or find. So it's not something that we can observe and we can test. So this is not a good hypothesis. So the hypothesis we decided to go with is the presence of salt affects the freezing point of water. So at this point, it doesn't matter if that hypothesis is right or wrong, as long as we are able to test this, whether it is right or not. So the key point of the hypothesis is that we can test it. So just to reiterate, the hypothesis is a testable explanation, so something that we can test scientifically. And the example, as we've said, the presence of salt affects the freezing point of water. And a good way to structure the hypothesis when you're writing your own hypothesis is to use this format. We have a particular variable, for example, the presence of salt. So that's variable 1 over here. Affects, so you can see why I've highlighted affects, because that variable 1, the presence of salt, is going to affect the variable 2, the freezing point of water. So this is variable 2. And we're going to be talking about the different variables later on. But this is a good way to structure your hypothesis. I'm going to show you some more examples so then you can practice later by yourself. So on the left hand side, you can see a question that's being posed. What effect does light have on plant growth? So I'm going to formulate my hypothesis, and I'm going to write down the light intensity affects the growth of plants. So you can see here, I've used that affects in the middle. The first variable is the light. So I've put down the light intensity here. And the second variable, which is this one here, the plant growth, is over here, the growth of plants. So the light intensity affects the growth of plants. So that's going to be my testable explanation. The next question: does the presence of leaves on trees affect the number of birds' nests? So in order to formulate my hypothesis, I'm going to look at that first variable, which is going to be leaves on trees. We have this keyword already, affect. The number of birds' nests is going to be my next variable. So my hypothesis is going to be the presence of leaves, which is the first variable here. So I'm going to put my first variable on the trees, affect the number of birds' nests, and that's going to be variable 2. And again, this next question is, what is the effect of watering plants on their growth height? So in order to formulate my hypothesis, I'm going to look at the first variable, which is going to be the watering plants. And growth height is going to be my second one. So I'm going to write down the volume of water used to water plants affect the growth height of plants. So again, this is going to be my first variable. Then we have affect again, And then we have height of plants, which is going to be variable 2. So that's how you would structure your hypothesis. You look at these variables. So the first variable is going to be affecting the second variable. So a quick recap on a hypothesis is a testable explanation. And when we're writing our hypothesis, we write down our first variable affecting the second variable. So that's the structure we're going to be using.